There's no question that COVID has impacted all of us, but those living with certain types of anxiety certainly have been impacted in a unique way when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. In this video, the MedCircle doctors are going to dive into post-traumatic stress disorder, social anxiety, panic disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder, and how people living with those conditions could have been impacted by COVID. The doctors will also reveal some of their favorite anxiety-reducing strategies. Thank you for being here. Make sure you like and subscribe to this channel for new mental health content each week.
Well, I think that one of the things I really saw was you've got to remember that the pandemic was an evolution, right? Here we are kind of going through this massive second wave, but I was actually just talking recently with a client about the fear we lived in the early pandemic, right? We were like, we're washing our groceries and all of that. Now, not many of us are washing our groceries anymore, but there's still a lot of fear around, who is more infectious? What does it mean to get this variant? Kids going back to school, all of that. So when we think about what the core of social anxiety is, which is an anxiety that's heightened by this idea of being socially scrutinized. And a person who's socially anxious believes that anytime they're in a social situation, they're being socially scrutinized. What's interesting is that a lot of people ended up having, who did, many people lost their jobs, but many people also had to start working remotely. You would think like, oh, you're in your house, it should be easier. Zoom is actually really socially anxious. And let me tell you what was so hard for people with social anxiety. They constantly had to look back at themselves. So when you think about if you're around a conference table at a meeting, you can't see your face unless by some strange coincidence, you're staring at a mirror, right? So for all these folks living with social anxiety, they're now having to look at their face while they're looking at all the other squares comprising the meeting. Yeah. And many people with social anxiety said, this actually took my self-monitoring to a whole new level. My face is sort of off. Like, what do people think of me? Do they like my background? Everyone else is looking really well put together. Like all of that social scrutiny, which they were doing anyhow, now got multiplied because they could actually monitor themselves. So some people found that to be very, very overwhelming. I will also say in the same breath, some of my socially anxious clients did find that there was now a little bit less pressure, though, to be put in the same kinds of environments of social, scrutiny. So some of them said, well, this is nice. I won't have to go to these conferences where there's these networking events as much, though they found a way to put the networking events on Zoom, which then took them back to having to look at their own faces. But some people did report that some of the other social pressures got lifted in a different way. And interestingly, and this was a very interesting observation I heard from more than a few socially anxious clients, covering your face with a mask, actually that anonymity made life a little bit easier. And so they found like, I cover my face. And in some ways, we were all almost wearing the same mask, right? So it's like everybody looked the same at the store or in some public settings. And so there were some things that in some clients, and this is very anecdotal, were saying, this kind of made some things for me a little bit easier. When it came to dating, it was also quite interesting because obviously socially anxious people who may have social anxiety, they still want the rewards of an intimate, close relationship, but they find dating to be difficult. And some folks told me that they're like, it was interesting. You had to do a lot remotely before you maybe took the plunge to get tested and take walks. And you were very tentative. The dating process kind of moved a little bit more slowly. And they found that actually to be more useful because they felt that I could actually email or text with someone, talk with them on the phone, build up maybe to video calls, but I was still in the comfort of my home, surrounded by the things that felt comfortable. So I do think that there were both pros and cons to folks who were living with social anxiety and how they were affected by a lot of the issues in the pandemic. But don't forget too, Kyle, people who are socially anxious are also anxious. And that means that all the anxiety raised by the pandemic likely made some of the social anxiety feel worse.
Yeah, really excellent. I didn't realize some of those, but it makes perfect sense when I hear it. Where is the line between the environment enabling unhealthy avoidance behavior, where I'm socially anxious, COVID happens, I can use it as an excuse to isolate, or where the environment actually promotes me saying, you know what, I'm going to put my mask on because I feel like everybody else, I'm a little less anxious in this group. And now I can actually go on a walk where before I couldn't, because I feel like I blend in a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we look at any sort of psychiatric or mental health diagnosis, we look at two, key elements: social and occupational impairment and subjective distress, how uncomfortable the person is. So for when we talk about crossing a line, for the person who really is completely avoiding everything, which is one of the dangers with anxiety disorders. It's avoidance of any social contact. It's avoidance of any socializing. It's the avoidance of putting themselves in a situation where there's any kind of social scrutiny happening. That if that avoidance kept going on during the pandemic, that's always going to be a problem, pandemic or no pandemic. But it is interesting that in a way, some of the parameters around having to mask ourselves up, having to protect ourselves, might have given folks who are socially anxious one of the biggest tools that I would give them as a therapist, which is, as with all anxiety disorders, building up gradually is important, right? We wouldn't say to someone, hey, you have social anxiety disorder, let's throw you into a 500-person meet and greet. Probably not so great. But the gradualness might be like, okay, let's make sure you're socializing in small, comfortable groups, and then build it up and build it up and build it up. Well, that's a little of what the pandemic actually kind of forced a person's hand on. So it may have done, as you said, facilitated getting out into the world in a way that might have felt more gradual. But you're absolutely right, Kyle. There was also that sense of, I'm off the hook socially. But you got to remember, being social, being in the social world is a muscle that really, really got weak for a lot of us during the pandemic. Like, a lot of people are saying, I'm actually not so good at socializing anymore. Like, even people who aren't socially anxious are saying, not so good at small talk, kind of only know how to talk to my remote and my Netflix and my cat. Like, they're saying, like, I need to learn some of those rhythms again, the give and take of conversation, being physically in someone's presence. These are skills a lot of us kind of slipped back on, especially if we were much, much more sort of socially isolating and distancing from the world. For people with social anxiety, that muscle was already not really strong for them. So now they're almost having to do double the workout. It's imagine like you don't work out for a year and a half and you try to get back into it. It kind of feels tight.
So panic disorder is a type of anxiety disorder where people experience all kinds of physiological symptoms, usually all of a sudden, and it can cause them to think that they're having a medical problem or that perhaps they're dying. People with panic disorder will have these symptoms out of nowhere, and it starts to change the way they live their life. They're afraid that they're going to have it in public. And so they start avoiding going out, or they start restricting their own movement. And it causes a lot of fear and anticipation about when the next symptoms or the next episode is going to come on.
During 2020, when the pandemic was seemingly at its peak, how would somebody living with panic disorder be affected by that type of isolation?
COVID has already led to increasing isolation. A lot of people are already having more anxiety about reentry, what that might look like, what is a safe protocol, what is not, whether or not they should be taking the vaccine. And all of these types of stressors are more likely to lead to the onset of more panic episodes. And when that happens, the individual will restrict their movement even more. They'll isolate themselves. Sometimes people are really embarrassed and ashamed that they're having these symptoms. And they think of it as a potential weakness in their character, rather than this is a medical and psychological condition that can be easily treated and has nothing to do with your strength of character. And so I think that that is one of the biggest issues, is that people don't talk about it enough and they're suffering in silence.
So certainly people living with panic disorder could have seen an increase in their symptoms during COVID-19. But in your private practice, did you notice any increase in people coming in with symptomology around panic disorder because of what was going on with COVID?
Absolutely. I think that people are hypervigilant to their own bodily symptoms because of COVID. People are worried that maybe they have COVID symptoms. And as a result, they're paying more attention to what's going on in their body. And sometimes we have these symptoms of panic attack coming on. They're not medical in nature, but they feel that way. And it causes people to think, oh, maybe I have COVID, or maybe even something more serious of an illness, and they go and seek medical support. When they get evaluated, everything comes back clean bill of health from the medical side, but the doctor says, you need to be evaluated for anxiety or for a panic disorder. And so I think that people are coming to their medical professionals more to investigate bodily symptoms that might look like a bona fide illness like COVID, but actually were the symptoms of a panic disorder.
Wow, that makes perfect sense. And it leads me to believe that there could be some positive with that, where some people may not have, or may have been pushing down their symptoms of panic or anxiety pre-COVID, but when COVID came around, they said, oh my gosh, maybe I should go get checked. There's a lot going on in the world. And when they do, maybe for the first time, they've heard that they are struggling with anxiety or even a panic disorder, and then they can seek that right treatment. Do you think there's truth in that being a positive thing?
Absolutely. One silver lining of COVID, and there actually are many, even despite the fact that we are going through essentially a worldwide tragedy and a worldwide trauma right now, is that there has been more attention to mental health and mental health awareness and destigmatizing that conversation, because so many people are experiencing anxiety and depression. In the US alone, in this past year, up to half of people have described having anxiety and depression symptoms sometimes, and a third of those people have had clinically significant anxiety or depression symptoms. So it's allowed us to open up the conversation more, to not judge one another, and essentially be able to seek the professional support that we need to be able to get better.
And I think that, COVID-19 in general has created an environment where people who otherwise might not have regularly experienced anxiety or understood anxiety actually have some access. Many people are describing, gosh, I've never had anxiety before, but now I am worrying more. I've got more insomnia. I'm ruminating, right? It's just excessive worried thoughts, right? I might feel restless or fidgety, especially with the restrictions in regard to isolation, those kind of things. So it can be helpful to differentiate a little bit. What's the difference between the general symptoms of anxiety that I think a lot of people across the world are experiencing due to the COVID-19 virus versus generalized anxiety, the time when it's really probably useful to go seek some medical or professional help, so seeking therapy or medications. So when it comes to generalized anxiety disorder, we're talking about 6 months or more of excessive anxiety resulting in some of these symptoms. So restlessness, inability to focus or concentrate, fatigue. Some people will have insomnia. For people who had an underlying diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder prior to COVID, often these symptoms are just exacerbated, and the normal symptoms that they might have, or normal things they might have been worried about, may now be kind of hyper-focused on the coronavirus. So things like, will I get sick? How do I navigate the just restlessness that can come with isolation? So lots of people are kind of having symptoms above and beyond. And what really differentiates between, gosh, I've got anxiety over what's going on a bigger scale, and the disorder is how much dysfunction it's causing in your life. So if it is disrupting relationships, if it's getting in the way of being able to do the normal social things that you would do, if you're having trouble getting to the grocery store or even focusing to get the groceries ordered online, if you're cutting off social contacts, even the Zoom contacts that may not be the way we wanted them before, more isolation, we really want to look in and look at the kind of severity of symptoms, how it's affecting your life. And when it's having an impact on your life, that's the time to seek professional help. Now, outside of that, because again, this is a time when everyone, I'll take that back, not everyone, but most people are experiencing higher levels of anxiety, higher levels of stress and worry. I would suggest that in obviously medications and therapy are super helpful and important, but there are lots of things that, whether you've got generalized anxiety or anxiety at large from what's going on, that we can do, including mindfulness, exercise, trying to push ourselves, even when we're feeling anxious about it, to socially connect, to get on that Zoom call, even if you don't feel like necessarily engaging. As humans, that social connection can be so helpful. And finding those specific things that really make a difference for you in regard to regulating those physiological sensations of anxiety, that restlessness, go for a walk, right? If you're feeling isolated and alone, reach out to someone. And, I think having those things that work for you on a regular basis and really kind of challenging yourself to engage in order to take care of yourself is just so important during these times.
The thing about PTSD is that death, violence, really upsetting things can trigger your symptoms. So a lot of my patients will say, I have my good months and then I have terrible months. And for them, seeing a lot of death and hearing a lot of stress and seeing grieving on television and on social media back to back in the headlines, it was very triggering for them. And so I think that this pandemic in particular has been hard for survivors because they are constantly triggered and they sometimes feel alone and disconnected from the world. So it's been a particularly challenging time for trauma survivors. So typically when something really terrible, usually something life-threatening or a sexual trauma happens, your body, your brain is never the same. And so typically when people have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, they experience things like re-experiencing the flashbacks, the nightmares, maybe intrusive thoughts, intrusive unwanted memories. Additionally, they may have this negative mood experiences where they're either depressed or they feel guilty, they blame themselves. They may have cognitive symptoms, poor concentration. They may not be able to sleep well. And so PTSD is a cluster of symptoms that typically follows a major trauma, and your body goes into fight or flight. You at times feel as if you have no control, and it can be quite distressing.
Do you think there are people who've been through the last year and are experiencing symptoms of PTSD that were caused by the environment from COVID?
I do, and I think that for people, especially those who've lost loved ones, who let's say they had someone who was feeling sick and they went into the hospital and then they did not return. So there was no closure. There was just this wondering of what is happening to my loved one. How did they die? What were the details around their death? A lot of these unknowns. And also, a lot of, unfortunately, just death around. I think that worsened the prognosis for many people who suffer with PTSD this year.
I would say social anxiety. All anxieties, have the universal issues of sort of physiological arousal, avoidance of the thing that makes you uncomfortable, apprehension when you think about that situation. So if we wanted to break it down, I would say that we almost want to think of any mental health issue, social anxiety included, in 4 ways: how it affects us emotionally or our feelings, how it affects our behaviors, how it affects our thoughts, how it affects us physically. And when you think about how to intervene, good sorts of interventions, treatments, therapies take on all 4 of those areas. So when it comes to feelings, that could be anything, including expressing them, journaling them. There's a lot of good apps on that. Sort of see, like, do your feelings waver during the day? Are there certain triggers that may leave you feeling more or less anxious? And how can you sort of shape your day around that? Physically, sort of pay attention to how you feel physically. I know that, certainly there are a whole bunch of videos, there's a whole bunch of videos that MedCircle has done over the years on breathing. And so there's all these kinds of physical techniques so you don't feel like physically you're getting overwhelmed. One thing that I always recommend to clients who are experiencing anxiety in any form is non-aerobic exercise. You want to do aerobic exercise, that's on you. But that of aerobic exercise can sometimes leave people feeling even more anxious. So things like weight training, yoga, stretching, things that aren't meant to get your heart rate up, but still move the body. the more an anxious person feels like they're connected to their body, that can also often help them feel in a little bit more control of some of that physiological arousal. Then there's the thinking, the cognitive part, which is a huge part of anxiety. How we think about something is how anxious we are about it. If we think something's dangerous, we're going to get more anxious. So we have to learn to tell ourselves different stories. And it's often that I'll say, ask someone, what's the story you tell yourself about this or that? Now, what's an alternate story? So it's really about coming up with is there an alternate version of this that you can sort of share with yourself? And then behaviorally, like I said, avoidance is the core of anxiety. Things like don't avoid, but you don't have to put yourself all in. For a lot of socially anxious folks during the pandemic, this was actually, I think, this was something I had suggested on some TV show, like at the very beginning of the pandemic, was things like, I want you to take, like all of us have our contacts in our phone now. I said, start at the top of the alphabet. Give yourself 26 weeks. Start with your A's. Find someone in your A's who you kind of like. Maybe it's someone from the workplace you don't get to see in person anymore. Maybe it's just someone you haven't been in touch with. And then send them a text or an email or even a handwritten card. Hey, I was just thinking about you, saw your name in my phone. How have you been doing? How's your family doing with everything that's going on? 1 a week, 26 weeks, 6 months. The nice thing about this is it flexes that social muscle. At least half of these people are probably going to respond, and maybe a half of that half will stay in touch. So it's something that a socially anxious person may actually feel in control of. It may actually be kind of nice to connect with people from your past. It may also be not nice. You'll be like, kind of glad I haven't been in touch with that person. But it is a social muscle that we get to flex. And many times people who are socially anxious will say, well, I haven't been in touch with them. They're not going to think well of me. Give it a shot. How nice to get a text that isn't someone telling you to do something or where are you or what time, but it's like, hey, I was just thinking about you and wanted to know how you're doing. Like, oh, and most people want to get that text. So that might be ways to sort of gradually scaffold a social world. And the final piece I'd suggest, and this applies to all anxiety disorders, become friends with your sympathetic nervous system. Our sympathetic nervous system can often, it's a nightmare for anxious people, right? It's the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn kind of a state that people have. Pay attention to that fight, flight, freeze, and understand, because a lot of people, so let's say something makes me anxious, Kyle. I'm like, I got to get out of here. Like we get like that, right? But sometimes at those moments, I was like, okay, Ramani, your sympathetic nervous system is your friend. It's just trying to say, like something's going on here that's not comfortable. And I almost talked myself through, instead of like getting so caught up in the physical danger, I'm saying, oh, their sympathetic nervous system is like a really, really kind of, I don't know, like an auntie that's saying, oh, we got to pay attention here, like a little bit like, oh, it's my nervous auntie. And so now I can listen and view it as a friend rather than this constant sense of attack. People who have anxiety disorders tend to have that really high sympathetic arousal. So they always feel like they're in a crisis. But if you think of it as sort of the hypervigilant auntie, it kind of helps it a little bit.
It's really important that we just focus on the basics when you notice anxiety symptoms setting in. And the basics are things like breathing when you're in the middle of an anxiety or panic episode, or when you feel overwhelmed. One of my favorite breathing techniques is the box breathing technique, where you trace a box with your hand, and with each tracing, you either hold your breath or you're breathing in or out. So essentially you breathe in for 4, hold for 4 as you draw the top of the box, breathe out for 4 as you draw the side of the box. And then as you close the box, you hold for 4 again. You repeat that 10 times. It really resets the panic symptoms that you might have, and also that fight or flight complex that can come on. And then really the other sides of going back to basics is really focusing on taking good care of your body and mind by sleeping well, eating well, getting exercise, making sure that you have some kind of social engagement every day, and that you make time for your hobbies and the things that are really meaningful to you. If you take care of yourself using those 5 daily self-care tips, you're less likely to feel overwhelmed, less likely to have panic symptoms, and less likely to experience intractable depression.
There's this fine line between, am I just going to push myself? Like, I'm anxious, I know I have to go for a walk, or running really helps me. Well, maybe today I can attune to myself and say, I'm not in the place to go for a run, but but I know that movement helps. So I'm going to put my shoes on. And if I can just walk out the door and go for a walk, that's going to be helpful. So how do I stay attuned to myself? It's kind of like, right, we don't want to be the harsh parent that says, you have to do this even when you're feeling crummy. We also don't want to say, oh, lay on the couch all day and do, because we know that that's going to make you feel worse. So the parent to ourselves that can say, okay, I'm not feeling great. I'm not going to go for a run, but I can at least walk around the block. I can get some fresh air, right? So finding that middle ground of really kind of encouraging rather than pushing or, berating ourselves for doing some of these things. Because I've certainly seen people take their anxiety, regulation checklist to the extreme to where it actually becomes something that they can attack themselves over. So again, always coming from that place of compassion and attuning to exactly where you are. Where am I today? And what do I have the capacity to do today, which may be different from yesterday or different from what you can do tomorrow. There's, as most people know, there's tons of different direct anxiety regulation techniques that we can do. Some of those have already been mentioned, and there's lots of great resources online through YouTube and through other sources to be able to find out how to do physiological regulation of your anxiety. As a psychodynamic therapist, I would suggest that one of the things that we can also do is actually look underneath the anxiety and try to find out what's driving it. So anxiety, from my perspective, is always a signal flag that lets us know that we've got some feelings about what's going on. So if you've been isolated, you're going to have some feelings about that. And the more that we can allow ourselves to feel the grief of the loss, to feel angry on either side of the political spectrum that you're on in regard to masks and vaccines and all of these things and the perpetuation of this virus, right? The more that we can allow ourselves access to feelings, we can exhale, and some of that anxiety comes down. Because if we understand that anxiety is a physiological response over mixed feelings, right? We can regulate the anxiety, but those feelings are still there. So when we regulate, we can then also look underneath and say, what is it that's coming up that I'm trying to keep at bay? What tears am I trying to hold back, or rage that I'm feeling, right? Or even guilt over, I know Dr. Ramani talked about survivor guilt of, gosh, COVID has actually been a place where I've connected more with my children, right? And so if I can allow all the mixed feelings that come up, my anxiety will come down. And it's basically getting at the root cause of what's driving the anxiety. So I absolutely think that anxiety regulation techniques that specifically target the anxiety are very helpful. And if we want to do some of that deeper work to look and see, we can just ask ourselves, right, what am I feeling underneath this? And this is also a place where connecting with a therapist can be very helpful to try and unearth and understand what is it that's driving this anxiety? Why am I so anxious right now?
So one of the symptoms of PTSD that a lot of people, I have people who've told me for years, no one understood what they were going through, was the dissociation. So feeling as if your body is not your body, feeling detached from a situation. And I think that being grounded can be super helpful for people who are survivors of trauma. And I like to use very simple mindfulness techniques. So in any given moment, utilize a sense. It could be a sense of smell. So, I keep candles in my office, and especially very fragrant ones. Focus on that one thing. For example, I'm going to be present. I'm going to stay grounded. I'm going to smell flowers. I smell fragrances like lavender. I smell notes of vanilla. And something as simple as stimulating a sense can help someone to feel grounded and more in control, especially if they're in the middle of a flashback or a panic attack or some other dysregulating symptom that coincides with PTSD. People were at home.
Yeah.
They needed to increase their points of joy.
Mm-hmm.
And candles are very soothing. They can transport you from an apartment to an island or
Yes.
to an exotic country.
Yes.
And so again, it's an immersive experience. And I think that it connected with people on so many levels, including several celebrities, Oscar winners. They were posting about these candles. So it really just took off. And I think it really did fill that need for that sensory stimulation to self-soothe.
Yeah. I mean, in my house, I have candles everywhere, and I light them at specific times during the day. And I can even feel my body change as I light the candle that is meant for the evening time, because I know, okay, work is done for the day. I get to relax. I get to smell this white tea, And I guess I was just doing it non-intentionally, non-consciously. But when you bring up really getting mindful about the sense in your environment and the other senses in your environment, I think it really does bring you back to present and eases your anxiety.
Certainly. And, there's a lot of research. I'm a researcher. I have my own lab in Midtown Manhattan. And there's a lot of research about the olfactory neurons. These are the largest neurons, right? And they're sitting right behind the nose. And when you smell something, it just literally transports your mind elsewhere. It can trigger memories. And so imagine if you're in the middle of a flashback and you're feeling extremely vulnerable, just something as simple as smelling a fragrance can take you away from that, can distract you. It doesn't invalidate your experience. It just allows you to stay grounded so you can practice the skills that you've learned in therapy.
Thanks for watching. Check out the links below for more information on how to access this full series, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch new mental health videos every week. Did you like what you heard in this video? If you want to ask a MedCircle doctor a question directly, you can learn how by visiting the links in the description below.